king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 3:14 Springs and Bearings. Since she and Marin had married, Angela began to hope that she could get pregnant and give birth to the heir of the earldom. Then, she began to ask the tailor to make some spare baby clothes in a somewhat neurotic way. Moreover, although I used to like traveling by car, I have become cautious. In Angela's words, the carriage is too bumpy, and the friction between the wheels and the axle is also very harsh. Marin didn't know how to persuade Angela, he felt that Angela was overreacting. But what made Marin speechless was that since Archbishop Rovere's lover Lucrezia and his youngest daughter Felice came to East Frisia, Angela kept holding her mother and sister and liked to take them to visit various places. In fact, in addition to taking care of her family and making them happy, Angela also has some small thoughts of showing off. You know, Felice has been a competitive person since she was a child, and she is always dissatisfied with Angela. Because the eldest sister died early, the two sisters often quarreled with each other. Now, when she finds an opportunity to show off her status as a countess, Angela will naturally not let it go. Therefore, Angela often took her mother and sister to various places for inspection, accepting the admiration and cheers of the subjects, and by the way, stimulating her sister Felice, who had been disobedient to her since childhood. Felice was indeed very angry. Although she was much better off in East Frisia than in the landowner's house in Genoa, and her mother no longer had to be a nanny, Felice felt extremely inferior. It was because she had married a fool under the witness of God. As long as the fool was alive, Felice would be the fool's wife. Her second sister Angela, who had never been convinced since childhood, was also a refugee, but she was able to find a count as her husband, which really made her angry. However, Felice was very fascinated by the good life her sister gave her. You know, in the countryside of Genoa, she was just a maid who took care of her idiot husband. The reason why the local rich man chose her as his daughter-in-law was because his son was an idiot and no one was willing to marry him, so he chose Felice, who was fleeing. In fact, the local rich man clearly regarded Felice as a maid who would take care of his son for the rest of his life. You know, Felice's nominal idiot husband has an IQ of only a 3-year-old child. He only knows how to eat and drink, and even needs Felice to help him go to the toilet. Moreover, although they were called rural rich people, Felice and her daughter did not eat well there. They ate black bread every day and occasionally had meat. It was not like in her sister's palace, where they ate delicious food that was said to be from the East every day and could wear all kinds of beautiful clothes. Felice was almost crazy with jealousy. She wanted to replace her sister and become the wife of her brother-in-law Marin. However, Felice had become a little darker due to the hard life in the past 2 years, and her appearance was not as beautiful as Angela. Therefore, the chance that Marin would fall in love with her and not Angela was very small. Therefore, Felice had no choice but to follow her mother and sister in a depressed mood, accompanying her sister to tour the county of East Frisia while she showed off. However, Angela was very dissatisfied with the jolting carriage. So, in the name of protecting the child she might be carrying, she urged her extremely smart husband Marin to quickly invent a carriage for her that would not jolt and would not make the axle make a harsh friction sound. In her eyes, her husband was omnipotent. Marin had no choice but to start recalling how to make the carriage less bumpy. Actually, it is quite simple. To avoid bumps, just install a large spring on the support frame between the axle and the car body. To avoid harsh friction noise, just install anti-friction bearings between the axle and the wheel. But it's easier said than done. First of all, special spring steel is needed to make springs. In addition, the process of making springs is also complicated. The shape of the rolled spring is not complicated. It is easier to shape it by just winding a hot wire around a column. However, the subsequent annealing and other treatments are more troublesome. Marin didn't study mechanics in his previous life, so how could he understand the specific processing process? Knowing the principle was considered erudition. Therefore, how to ensure the elasticity of the spring and how to restore the original shape after being stretched was also a bit troublesome. In fact, some watchmakers have already made similar models of the simplest spiral spring. However, they use ordinary iron wire to roll, which has little practical value. Because the spring made of ordinary iron wire is difficult to return to its original shape after deformation. Only springs made of spring steel, after special treatment, can be guaranteed not to deform easily. Therefore, before making springs, Marin had to get the legendary spring steel first. Marin didn't know the formula of other spring steels, he only knew 65 carbon steel. Among them, this steel contains manganese. Fortunately, Marin's men bought pyrolusite in Hungary, enough for Marin to carry out research. However, as a count, how could Marin study it himself? So Marin pushed the matter to Leonardo da Vinci and a group of Italian watchmakers. These tech geeks seemed very interested in springs and actually accepted it happily. Once they have made the right spring steel, Marin will arrange for craftsmen to use thin iron bars, heat them red, and bend them around the pillars to form large coil springs. After annealing, they will become springs specifically for carriages. After handing over the development of the spring to Leonardo da Vinci, Marin went to find a blacksmith to process the ball bearings. Bearings are much easier to make than springs, of course, provided that Marin made the simplest caged ball bearings. In his previous life, Marin started riding a bicycle when he was young, and he had repaired his bicycle hundreds or thousands of times. Therefore, Marin was very familiar with caged ball bicycle bearings. The simplest caged ball is a space between two steel rings, inner and outer, divided into 12, or other number, blocks, with a steel ball of the same size placed in each block. Then, a steel shell, cage, is placed on the outside. The double-layer steel ring containing the steel ball is not, but the protruding steel ball is in contact with it. These steel balls are all coated with engine oil, and the friction between them and the cage is very small. However, after a period of time, the shell must be disassembled and some engine oil must be added. Because, if there is a lack of engine oil, the steel balls are easy to wear. When worn, the steel balls must be replaced. Of course, modern steel balls are made of alloy steel, which is very wear-resistant. However, in the era when Marin was in, there was no very wear-resistant alloy steel. Therefore, Marin directly used cast iron to manufacture ball bearings. Whether it is the inner ring, outer ring, rolling element or cage, they are all cast iron. Moreover, modern bearings are all made by machines, so small bearings are also easy to make. But Marin obviously did not have a machine, so he could only use the sand casting method. Therefore, he could only make larger bearings. Therefore, the carriage bearings were made slightly larger. The steel balls on the bicycle, which were smaller than soybeans, were cast into cast iron beads the size of glass balls by Marin's sand casting craftsmen. As a result, because the iron balls were too big, the cage ball could not hold 12 of them, and only 6 were held. Then, when choosing lubricant, Marin directly chose the more viscous butter. However, the test results showed that this most primitive cage ball bearing, although bulky and ugly, was very effective. At least, after installing it on Angela's carriage, there was no more squeaking axle friction sound. However, the spring steel developed by Leonardo da Vinci and others has not been released yet. Therefore, the time to reduce the elasticity of the carriage will naturally be postponed. As for using inferior iron springs first, Marin did not consider it. Because, after the springs are made, they only need to directly support the carriage. If the material is too inferior, it is easy to cause the spring to break. If so, it is easy to cause the carriage to overturn and cause an accident. Marin dare not let Angela take risks. If it breaks, it will be bad. Therefore, he would rather wait for Da Vinci and others to make qualified spring steel than use ordinary materials to make car springs. Chapter 315, Planning for the construction of Egyptian trade route. Because of the large-scale production of large pieces of flat glass, the natural soda bought from Venice was quickly consumed. Therefore, Romine asked Marin for help, hoping to get more natural soda. Originally, Marin was going to send people to Venice to purchase. However, the words of a Jewish businessman who had helped Marin buy Arabian horses made Marin change his mind. It turned out that the businessman told Marin that Egypt under the rule of the Mamluk dynasty not only had abundant natural soda, but also many Arabian horses. In addition, there was a lot of bitter Glauber's salt, which is sodium sulfate. The alkaline valley near Cairo, Egypt, is a world-famous natural soda-producing area. Marin then remembered that before the emergence of Lebrents during the Napoleonic War, one of the important sources of natural soda in Europe was the alkaline valley in Egypt, and it was the most important source. Moreover, Marin planned to go to North America to make paper, and he also needed a lot of sodium sulfate to cook pulp with logs. Egypt has many deserts, and there are many saline lakes in the desert, so the bitter sodium sulfate hydrate crystals can be picked up by the lake at will, and they are very cheap. Moreover, Marin did not want the shrewd Venetian merchants to know that he was buying large quantities of sodium sulfate, so as not to be strangled by them. Therefore, Marin decided to organize his own fleet to go to Egypt to buy large quantities of natural alkali and sodium sulfate. Of course, he could also buy some excellent Arabian horses. Of course, Egypt also has a treasure, that is castor oil. Castor oil is a very good lubricant. In later generations, it is a high-end aviation lubricant. Castor oil is not easy to oxidize in the air, has high viscosity, and a very low friction coefficient of only 0.1. It is a very good mechanical lubricant. Marin currently does not have the technical ability to extract oil and cannot produce cheap mineral lubricants. So the best lubricant he can choose is castor oil. And Egypt is one of the origins of castor oil. As long as Marin placed an order and encouraged the Egyptians to grow castor beans in large quantities, and then he provided a screw press, it would not be difficult to obtain a large amount of castor oil. You know, the Nile River has a lot of water, making the Nile River basin in Egypt a very suitable area for agricultural planting. As for Egyptian long staple cotton, although Marin wanted it, he had read history and knew that Egyptian long staple cotton was introduced by Muhammad Ali, the founder of the Ali dynasty in Egypt in the early 19th century. Therefore, at this moment, Egypt did not have the famous Egyptian long staple cotton, nor did it grow rice. But even so, natural soda, natural sodium sulfate, castor oil and Arabian horses are worth it for Marin to open an independent route to Egypt. However, according to the opinions of Italian shipbuilders, in the Mediterranean region, because the wind is weak and the wind often stops, it is better to use paddle boats than pure sailing boats. So, Marin finally decided to build a few galleys for sailing in the Mediterranean Sea. However, for the sake of safety, Marin asked the Venetian shipbuilders who had extensive experience in building galleys to make some improvements to the galleys and increase the position of the cannons to adapt to naval battles. At this time, the galleys of Venice were still guided by the idea of jumping out of the window to help fight, and the whole structure did not leave much room for artillery. Therefore, Marin asked the Venetian shipbuilders to arrange as many artillery positions as possible to facilitate naval battles. These shipbuilders from Venice were eager to meet Marin's request. Because they were too skilled in making galleys. Even if some changes were needed to leave some positions for artillery, it would not affect their ability. After all, they had been making galleys for many years. Some of the craftsmen had even participated in the manufacture of 500-ton Venetian galleys, and their skills were very strong. Then, Marin selected 100 people from the 200 Venetian shipbuilders and led a group of carpenters to start building a 500-ton galley with gun positions. In order to facilitate shipbuilding, Marin asked those experienced Venetian shipbuilders to draw the data of ship ribs, and then handed them over to the most secret department of the Emden shipyard that used steam boxes to bend ship ribs, and prepared fixed frames and stone troughs of consistent specifications to mass-produce the required ship ribs. In this way, after the keel is laid, batches of standard ship ribs can be nailed directly to the main keel, greatly shortening the shipbuilding time. In fact, by opening the Egyptian trade route, Marin could not only import cheap natural soda, Glauber's salt, castor oil and Arabian horses from Egypt, but also purchase large quantities of cheap wool from Egypt. Because sheep farming is popular in the Arab region. Mutton is also the main meat of Arabs. Therefore, there is a lot of wool there, and it is also very cheap. Although Arabs did not specifically breed wool-producing sheep, resulting in average wool quality. However, because of the large quantity and low price, it can make up for the defect of average quality. After all, British wool is too expensive. Even if the Egyptian wool is shipped back from Europe, the cost is much lower than buying British wool. In fact, the best wool in Marin's mind is the wool of Spanish merino sheep. Merino sheep not only has fine wool and good quality, but also has very good mutton, making it a good breed for both wool and meat. However, Spain regards merino sheep as a treasure and does not allow the export of live merino sheep easily. But this is not an obstacle for Marin, because he still has the title of Spanish Wilderness Count and is qualified to buy this kind of sheep. However, Marin knew that merino sheep prefer a drier climate, such as Australia. In North America, because it is relatively humid, merino sheep are prone to hoof rot when they arrive on the east coast of North America. Therefore, even if merino sheep can be introduced, Marin cannot have suitable grazing land. Unless he sends people to occupy Australia now. But that is meaningless, because even if Marin grazes a large number of merino sheep in Australia, the distance is too far, and the cost of transporting merino wool from Australia to Europe is very high. It is better to import high-priced wool directly from the UK. Therefore, for now, Marin might as well give up high-end wool and directly import Arabian sheep wool of average quality but cheap from Egypt for use in the wool textile industry, specializing in the production of medium and low-end wool fabrics. Marin calculated that because the ship ribs can be quickly mass-produced using advanced technology, it not only saves costs but also saves shipbuilding time. As long as the processing of the ribs is separated and the manufacturing of other parts is also carried out in a division of labor and cooperation, he can save the shipbuilding time to a short time of 3 or 4 months, instead of more than half a year or even more than a year required for normal shipbuilding. Moreover, the ribs can be mass-produced quickly. Therefore, the curved ribs required for multiple ships can be processed in a short period of time. Therefore, Marin's shipyard can build several ships at the same time. As long as they use the same specifications, several ships can be started at the same time. At that time, it will not take several months to build one ship, but several ships at the same time. Of course, the first ship might be built more slowly, but once the first ship is completed, the shipbuilders can record the specific data of the ribs and make the molds needed to accurately bend the ribs, so that the same type of ship can be mass-produced easily and quickly in the future. According to the principle of division of labor and cooperation, each shipbuilding craftsman only needs to repeat the same work and make a certain part of the ship. After it is built, it is measured with a precise ruler. Then, after everyone has built various parts of the ship, they just need to assemble and connect them, then apply oil and wait for them to dry. Doing so can greatly reduce the time required for shipbuilding and enable Marin to quickly own more ships. As long as there are enough ships and enough sailors are recruited and trained, Marin can quickly become the overlord of the ocean and occupy enough colonies to obtain huge benefits. Otherwise, without sufficient maritime power, all of Marin's discoveries are likely to be used for others. The galleys needed for the voyage to Egypt have already begun to be manufactured in full swing, and the relevant craftsmen are constantly recording the relevant data to facilitate mass production in the future. In fact, the first ship of this class was basically built by the shipbuilders, following their feelings. After it was built, it was necessary to frequently adjust and replace the wood. Not only that, the shipbuilders of this era followed their feelings when building each ship, and then constantly adjusted it. Therefore, shipbuilding in this era often takes more than half a year, and it is not uncommon to spend 1 or 2 years. However, Marlin's method of data recording in mass production with unified specifications can greatly reduce the time of shipbuilding, and each ship is very standard. As long as the first ship is successfully built, the subsequent ships will be built smoothly. While building the ship, Marin could also look for Jewish merchants who were familiar with the Egyptian routes to deal with the Egyptians. At the same time, it also helped Marin cultivate business talents. Once the galley was built, he could take it directly to Egypt for trade. As for the shortage of Romani natural soda, Marin thought about it and sent a Kirk sailing ship to Venice to purchase goods to meet the temporary demand. When his own Egyptian route is officially opened, he can kick out the Venetians and operate the relevant routes on his own. Chapter 316 Earl Edward in Paris, France. Edward, Earl of Warwick, had fled to France for several months. When Edward fled to France with his family keepsake, he was immediately treated as a treasure by the anti-British French and arranged for him to live in France. Not only did France regard Edward as an important bargaining chip to balance Britain, but King James IV of Scotland also regarded Edward as a weapon against Britain. Therefore, Earl Edward lived a good life in Paris. However, because he was imprisoned in the Tower of London by Henry VII at the age of 11 and was imprisoned for 14 years, Earl Edward, who was only 25 years old, had difficulty communicating with others. It is true that anyone who has been locked up for 14 years without seeing the sun would have difficulty communicating with others. After all, as a person who posed a great threat to Henry VII, Edward had been held in solitary confinement since childhood. The soldiers guarding him were forbidden to talk to him. After being released from captivity, Edward was somewhat uncomfortable with interacting with others. Therefore, during this period, he has been taking court etiquette classes and learning French in the court of Paris. The French really hoped to train Earl Edward to be the spokesperson of France in Britain. You know, even though he is already 25 years old, Earl Edward's mind is actually that of a big boy. Because he has been isolated from others since he was a child and has almost no contact with outsiders, his mind naturally cannot grow, and he even has severe autism. It just so happened that Louis XII was currently leading his army to attack the Kingdom of Naples and had no energy to deal with Count Edward's affairs. Therefore, Louis XII remotely ordered to send some court teachers to teach Count Edward court etiquette and French. While teaching Count Edward French, the teachers sent to teach Edward French were also required to instill in Count Edward the idea of friendship between France and Britain and the idea that France hoped to establish a Northwest European co-prosperity sphere headed by France. In fact, although Earl Edward became a little autistic, he was not stupid. He knew the ambitions of the French. Although the French and the Scots helped him, they had bad intentions. Their wish was not to help Edward, but to cause chaos in Britain. However, Edward grew up in a noble family and was not a fool. He knew that neither the French nor the Scots had good intentions. However, he had no other choice. As the more legitimate heir to England, he could not stay out of it. Even though he had never participated in activities against Henry VII, he was imprisoned for 14 years by Henry VII. If it weren't for his sister Margaret's idea of switch, he would have been killed by Henry VII by now. In order to survive, he had to stand against Henry VII and accept the reality of becoming a puppet of France and Scotland. If he dared to refuse to become such a pawn, the French could hand him over to Henry VII in a minute. And the only consequence of Henry VII catching him was to kill him. Earl Edward was also very grateful to the Dutch people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, who helped his sister rescue him from the Tower of London. Edison, the nominal leader of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, was also the object of Earl Edward's gratitude. Speaking of which, Marin is also very old-fashioned, and he just comes up with random names. He came up with Einstein before, and the North Sea Chamber of Commerce came up with Edison. This made Earl Edward very grateful to Edison, who was born more than 300 years later. However, Count Edward also mistakenly believed that the North Sea Chamber of Commerce was secretly supported by the Habsburg family. Because the North Sea Chamber of Commerce was ostensibly a chamber of commerce from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And Amsterdam was under the rule of the Habsburg family. Therefore, Count Edward also regarded Edison as a subordinate of the Habsburg family. It has to be said that this was a beautiful misunderstanding. Although his freedom was restricted to a certain extent, the French treated Earl Edward very well. At least, Earl Edward was treated as an exiled monarch, not as a prisoner in the Tower of London. In Paris, Count Edward greedily breathed in the fresh air of the wild and basked in the sunshine that he had not seen for 14 years. The French in the Paris court did not understand why Count Edward loved to bask in the sun so much. How could they understand how a poor child who had not seen the sun for 14 years once yearned for the sun? In addition to finding teachers to teach Edward court etiquette and French, the French also supported Edward in military affairs. Even though Louis XII was far away in Italy, he still instructed the country to select a group of apprentice knights who were not the eldest sons of noble families to follow Earl Edward. In addition, Louis XII also ordered to start recruiting wandering knights for Earl Edward and form a plate armor heavy cavalry. This era is no longer the era of the 100 Years' War between England and France. In this era, due to the great progress in plate armor manufacturing technology, plate armor has become very strong in defense against English longbows. Therefore, it is also very important to bring a large number of plate armor knights who can resist the barrage attack of English longbows. After the restoration of Henry V in 1470, Edward IV fled to Burgundy and borrowed 15,000 troops from Burgundy, including a large number of Burgundian plate knights. Under the impact of the Burgundian plate knights, Henry V, who had 30,000 troops, could not escape the fate of failure despite having a large number of English longbowmen. Because the longbowmen had limited lethality to the plate knights who were armed to the teeth. Once the plate knights rushed into the longbow formation, they could slaughter the longbowmen at will. Because the melee ability of the longbowmen was far inferior to that of the knights. At this time, the French planned to let Edward, Earl of Warwick, learn from his uncle Edward IV and use the large number of highly skilled French knights to defeat the longbow troops that the British were proud of and seize the British throne. To this end, Louis XII also reached a secret agreement with King James IV of Scotland through letters. The two countries agreed that if the York dynasty represented by the Earl of Warwick was successfully restored, both sides would send 10,000 troops to be stationed in London for a long time to secretly control this powerful country and suppress its strength and rise. Marin, the instigator of all this, was hiding behind the scenes, using the alias Edison, and was secretly happy. He had long known that a fake Richard could get the full support of France and Scotland, let alone a real Edward. After he helped Margaret rescue Edward, Earl of Warwick, he sent him to France. The French would take care of the rest, and he didn't need to get involved at all. As expected, the French were overjoyed when they got Edward, Earl of Warwick, and immediately took him to Paris to raise him and began to recruit soldiers for him. Even Scotland sent a large amount of money, weapons, and armor. Although Scotland was not strong and did not dare to challenge Britain head-on, when it came to stabbing England in the back, the Scots would never hesitate. Therefore, even if they did not openly help Earl Edward attack Britain, they had all the necessary support. Even the money, weapons and armor that were used to support Earl Edward were originally intended to be used to pay the Scottish regular army. Seeing that Earl Edward of Warwick was about to start a rebellion, King James IV of Scotland simply gave the military paying weapons and armor to Earl Edward to help him wreak havoc on the English. Under such circumstances, Earl Edward knew that he was just a puppet, but he still couldn't help but get excited. Because the French and Scots promised to help him recruit 20,000 troops to attack Britain and seize the throne. Among them, there would be thousands of trainee knights wearing plate armor. As soon as Louis XII returned to the court, the French would regard supporting Earl Edward to land in Britain and compete with Henry VII for the throne as an important top priority. Of course, the French also had conditions. In addition to the condition of stationing troops in London in the future, Earl Edward needed to marry a daughter of a French noble family in order to strengthen the marriage alliance with France.